Monday marks the 16th anniversary of the tragic September 11th attacks in the U.S. According to the country report on terrorism released by the U.S. State Department last year, terrorist attacks and fatalities from terrorism declined globally for the second year in a row in 2016. But terrorist groups continue to exploit ungoverned territory and ongoing conflicts to expand their reach and to direct and inspire more attacks around the world. How has the 9/11 tragedy reshaped America and the rest of the world? What are the root causes of terrorism, and have they been dealt with sufficiently? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, and in continuation of a CGTN special program, The Impact of 9/11. I will be joined by my colleagues in Washington, D.C. and Nairobi, Kenya. But first, let's take a look at this story. Now, in the years since attacks, security in New York has been increased. A special 500-strong counter-terrorism unit has been created, along with a special command center to monitor security cameras across the city. The White House said in the run-up to the anniversary that there are currently no credible threats against the U.S. But considering the recent terror attacks across Europe, is the city prepared for the worst? CGTN's Nick Harbour reports from New York.
A twisted girder from the Twin Towers at John Jay College in Manhattan is a reminder of when terrorism struck the city 16 years ago. But the New York Police Department says the addition of more officers and a focus on counter-terrorism since then has increased the city's security. And experts agree.
This is the safest city with over 1 million population in the United States. There is this spirit of alertness, which is at a higher level in this city than other cities in the United States or in North America.
Most visibly, security in Times Square, the site of the 2010 thwarted car bomb plot, has been stepped up. Steel bollards and concrete barriers have been added to stop attacks using vehicles, like those in the French city of Nice and at a holiday market in Berlin. But despite precautions, Times Square, like any busy tourist destination in New York, is a potential target. And given the recent wave of vehicle attacks by terrorists in Europe, it's a location with clear vulnerabilities. In May, a deliberate but non-terrorism-related car crash in Times Square put the city on alert.
I don't think you can prevent that type of attack. You know, lone terrorism is the most difficult thing to combat, because anywhere this could happen. This could happen in the streets of Beverly Hills or, you know, in the Midwest somewhere. And it's as disheartening when it does happen, but there's no way to really protect from it. Not yet.
New York officials, though, say they are prepared in a city where terrorism remains a pressing threat. Nick Harper, CGTN, New York.
And to get more perspectives, I'm joined live by my colleagues in Washington, D.C., Asiye Namdar, and in Nairobi, Kenya, Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to both of you on the point. First of all, let me go to Washington, D.C. Asiye, what kind of commemoration activities are we expecting?
There are commemorations in all the target areas that were attacked on that day, Lucien. We want to talk about how the direct attack really thrust the United States into war with troops deployed to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, the base of operations for 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden. We'll also talk about U.S. policy successes and failures, and really the influence on the U.S. political climate.
Okay, now lead us into it. Really looking forward to this part of the show, which will be led by you and your guest in D.C.
Well, four
Asiye?
planes turned into missiles on that day, September 11, 2001, really intended to strike the symbols of U.S. finance, defense, and politics. The fourth plane forced down by its passengers in Pennsylvania before it could reach the capital of Washington, D.C. Loved ones of those killed in the Pentagon attack holding a private commemoration. Owen Furclough joins me from the CGTN newsroom with more on the memorials and really the everlasting impact of 9/11. Owen.
Asiye, we're literally just a few minutes away from the moment when, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon here in the United States, the heart of the U.S. Defense Department. Donald Trump, U.S. President Donald Trump, and his wife Melania, the First Lady, are at a ceremony there. You can see images of them there at the Pentagon, not very far from where we are here in Washington, laying a wreath there to the 64 passengers and crew, and a total of 184 people who died when that flight crashed into the Pentagon. As I say, 184 lives lost, the youngest a 3-year-old child. There was a fireball of around 200 feet leaping into the air. Emergency services didn't declare that fire extinguished for 10 days. Such was the impact of that crash into the Pentagon. A little earlier, President Trump and the First Lady observed a moment of silence at the White House as well, around the time, of course, that first plane hit the Twin Towers in New York. But you can see here President Trump at the Pentagon, the heart of the U.S. defense establishment, and of course very much involved in how President Trump and his administration shaped that ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. More on that in a moment. Here you can see the U.S. flag being unfurled at the Pentagon, a building that sustained extensive damage in the wake of that crash by Flight 77 into the Pentagon. So that's the ceremony. You're looking at pictures now, a little earlier here in Washington, D.C., at the White House, with President Trump and First Lady Melania observing that remembrance ceremony. We should also talk as well about Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This is the place where Flight 93 crashed into a field. There are countless stories, RCA, of individual heroism on 9/11, but Flight 93 particularly stands out because it was thanks to the passengers and the crew of that flight that this was the only plane that did not reach its intended target. It's thought that that flight was trying to strike at the U.S. Capitol. That's the heart of the U.S. Congress. Thanks to the passengers and crew who grappled and fought with the hijackers chose to crash that flight into a field, killing all 40 passengers and crew on board, but sparing potentially many, many more casualties. So those are some of the ceremonies, both here in Washington, D.C. And in Pennsylvania, as the U.S. marks 16 years since 9/11.
Owen, let me ask you a question about Afghanistan. And we were talking to Peter Vincent about this. Is there really a change in strategy and sending more troops? Will it make it?
Well, we heard President Trump tell us just a few weeks ago, Askia, we will not engage, we are not nation building again. That was in that speech setting out his Afghanistan strategy. This is Donald Trump's first memorial in 9/11. He had no shortage of opinions on this, very critical of that war, but has now essentially U-turned and is committing thousands more troops to Afghanistan. He thinks this is the place where he can stamp out the people who are fueling terror, also putting pressure on Pakistan as well. So there's very much a sense there of a slight policy shift, trying to engage Pakistan to stop what he calls harboring people who are engaged in this kind of terror.
All right, Owen Fairclough, thank you so much. And Peter Vincent joins me once again in the studio. As I mentioned, he's a terrorism expert and former U.S. Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Department of Justice official, also a frequent guest here at CGTN America. Peter, I want to switch gears a little bit and really talk about the current political climate here in the United States. A lot of Muslim Americans in this country feel alienated by this administration. We have heard President Trump over and over again use the phrase radical Islam terrorism, and many critics would say that implies ISIS speaks for all Muslims. Does using that kind of phrase alienate Muslims and really play into the hands of terrorists?
Asya, unfortunately it does. I dare say that it offends not only Muslim Americans, but our vital partners that are from Muslim countries who are themselves Muslims. And it, in fact, works directly against our interests to partner with our allies in many countries across the globe to combat violent extremism of all forms. When the Trump administration took office, it, in fact, pivoted from focusing on all violent extremism to only focusing on what the president calls radical Islamic terrorism, leaving aside, of course, other insurgent and terrorist organizations that also cause great damage and harm across the world.
And when we talk about Trump's travel ban from 6 Muslim-majority countries, they are Iran, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. Peter, 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi Arabia, the rest Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon. None of these countries are part of that travel ban.
The travel ban initially issued on January 27th and then reissued with the deletion of Iraq on March 7th was ill-conceived, poorly drafted, and counterproductive. And it has done a great deal of harm, in my opinion, in terms of building trust between our allies and our partners in combating extremism. It is offensive. It has upset our best partners in the various regions, including North Africa and the Middle East. And as you correctly point out, none of the bombers on September 11th were from any of the 7, now 6 countries. So it's a bit counterproductive and a bit counterintuitive that those countries would have been selected.
Peter Vincent, thank you. We'll be back with you shortly. And the war in Afghanistan, well into its 16th year, the longest U.S. war, with the U.S. Commander-in-Chief President Trump, as we talked about earlier, ordering an additional 3,500 more troops to join the 8,000 already there. Lucian?
Yes, Asiya, thank you very much, and many thanks to the guests for providing their insight on this very important day. Now, we are about to see a speech given at the Pentagon by U.S. President Donald Trump in just a couple of minutes. But now let's take a look at some of the broader picture and addressing some of the deeper root causes of terrorism ever since the 9/11 attacks. And I'm joined from Chicago by Laura Schwartz, former advisor to President Clinton. Laura, thank you very much for being with us today. Now, in July and August 2016, 100 representatives from 47 countries attended a counter-terrorism seminar in Hawaii Asia-Pacific Security Research Center and agreed that the global security situation has been deteriorating. Terrorist threats have become a new normal, participants say, to many countries, including America. What is your take on the threat we're facing today in comparison to 10, 15 years ago?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a gravely important day for America to never forget. And it wasn't only the 3,000 people killed here in the United States that were from the United States, but 90 other countries had individuals that were killed in that attack. And that's why I believe when we look at how we heal the divide and how we combat terrorism, just looking at there were 90 countries represented on those planes that went down that day, shows us that we must be united with our allies, that we must build countries together economically and culturally and be more inclusive than exclusive. Because in this world of this global interdependence, what we do in America affects London, affects China, affects Africa, and the individual governments within. So the more that we can collaborate working as a global society and not an individualistic society that walls itself off, and I mean that literally, with President Donald Trump talking about the wall between Mexico and America, President Donald Trump and the ban on Muslims. It's just wrong to erect walls where the only way that we can combat terrorism is by more education, economic aid, and security throughout the entire world.
Yes, well,
to show we're not trying to stand alone. Sure. We need to stand together.
Yes, now we are still seeing live picture coming out of the Pentagon, but we'll be bringing you the speech by U.S. President Donald Trump in just a moment. But Laura, let me continue asking you this very important question, I believe, that is very important for the United States, especially, which is domestic terrorism. I understand that has been on the rise both in the U.S. and in Europe. In the U.S., we've seen most recently the car crashing into protesters in Charlottesville. In in Europe, second-generation immigrants are attacking their compatriots. What do you think are the reasons behind such domestic terrorism?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because these giant, spectacular attacks anymore. It's, like you said, the car in a crowd locally in the United States. It's a lone gunman inspired in a nightclub in Florida, or a couple who's been radicalized in San Bernardino, California. The face of terrorism has changed dramatically, and it's not that it's making it more acceptable, but it's showing that you can get a lot of coverage for just a small, what seems like a small act. And that's why you look at the anger in Charlottesville. We consider that domestic terrorism. It's white supremacists. It's people that feel they are worth more as human beings than other human beings of different colors, different religions. And that's simply not the case. So in America, it starts at the top. We need, or I would say, let me revise that. I think at one point it started at the top. When George W. Bush went on the mounds of Ground Zero after the 9/11 attacks, he said, we are all united. We are all united against this. Now here we are 16 years later. President Donald Trump is president after Charlottesville with horrible acts of domestic terrorism. And he says there are good people on all sides. I don't think we can start it from the top anymore, to be honest, Shen. I think we have to start it from the communities. We have to be tolerant of one another and more inclusive. So I think we've seen a shift, and it's very sadly so that I have to say that sitting here in the incredible United States in Chicago. Yeah. But I really believe the fate of the future of terrorism has shifted from the top to the communities in which we serve each other, no matter what our race or religion.
Yeah, you mentioned President Bush. Let me ask you this question. A professor from Sciences Po in Paris regarded former President Bush as waging war in the Middle East as opening the Pandora's box of terrorism. How do you look at the impact of America's anti-terrorist actions as in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks?
Well, in the aftermath with the military force that was taken, it is an agreement with a lot of Americans that George W. Bush chose the wrong war. He chose to use the attack from Al-Qaeda to go into Iraq and not Afghanistan, where the Taliban had planned these attacks. He chose not to do government dislodging of funds with Saudi Arabia, though the Saudi Arabian connection with the attack. So many Americans still feel today it did open up a Pandora's box, that it created a farm team, as we call it, for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it got us very much off points, and it cost a lot of blood and treasure, not just for America, but all of our allies that came together with us. We should be more focused, and I hope that today may serve as a turning point as we remember why we are in the Middle East, and to refocus and regroup, and starting with Afghanistan and cracking down on Pakistan's harboring of terrorists is a good first step. But the nation needs to use this to take back that Pandora's box and say, listen, we know we opened it, but now we've got a better idea of how to contain it and how to keep not just Americans, but all citizens of the world more safe.
Yeah, we also need partners. For instance, where you mentioned Pakistan, they had wrong strategic choices, but they are also victim, and they have been fighting terrorism very strongly. So I think maybe we need to have a second thought there. But anyway, many thanks, Laura Schwartz, a former advisor to President Clinton. And Africa is a continent which has also been facing severe security challenges, and we haven't heard much on our show about the situation over there. So let us cross over now to my colleague in Nairobi, Kenya, Beatrice Marshall. What is happening on your front on this very important day in the American history, and how is the security situation in Africa these days?
Indeed, Lucien, the situation in Africa remains rather fragile on the terrorism front. From the east to the west to the north, African governments are trying to grapple with the threat of terrorism. Now, it's been 19 years, though, since Al-Qaeda was formed by Osama bin Laden, and the group may not be in the headlines as much as ISIL these days, but it remains a global threat, including here in Africa. Let's listen in to Robert Nagila with that story.
In 2012, Al-Qaeda's North African branch, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, was at its pinnacle. Together with the Tuaregs, they controlled most of northern Mali. The group traces its origins to a guerrilla movement opposed to the Algerian government in the 90s. In 2006, Al-Qaeda bestowed membership status on the group. Its first major operation was in 2007, an attack on the UN compound in Algiers. A few years after they were routed by the French in Mali, AQIM has regrouped, seeking alliances with local jihadi groups and extending their influence across North and West Africa.
The country is held at siege. They attack anywhere they want, any time of their choice. They bypass the intelligence networks. Nobody can stop them. You can't stop their money or their weapons or their men.
Further east, Al-Qaeda also has links with Somali militant group Al-Shabaab.
They've taken a bit of a more invisible role and have been active in funding terror activities, in funding the collection of information against potential targets, and there's a constant risk element around Al-Qaeda.
Kenya has borne the brunt of their terror. The attack on an upscale shopping mall in the capital Nairobi that claimed 67 lives, and the massacre of 147 university students in northern Kenya, the worst of these attacks. Almost 20 years since Al-Qaeda was formed by Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, it remains one of the most formidable terror organizations, despite the death of its founder, with a global reach. Robert Magilla, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, U.S. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump are attending a commemoration ceremony at the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial to mark the 16th anniversary of the September 11 terrorist attacks. It is the first time for Trump to lead this tribute as Commander-in-Chief to honor the 184 people killed in the attack at the Pentagon. Well, let's now cross live to Arlington County, Virginia, and listen to remarks by President Trump.
Then here at the Pentagon, and then in Pennsylvania. The horror and anguish of that dark day were seared into our national memory forever. It was the worst attack on our country since Pearl Harbor, and even worse because this was an attack on civilians, innocent men, women, and children whose lives were taken so needlessly. For the families with us on this anniversary, we know that not a single day goes by when you don't think about the loved one stolen from your life. Today, our entire nation grieves with you, and with every family of those 2,977 innocent souls who were murdered by terrorists 16 years ago. Each family here today represents a son or daughter, a sister or brother, a mother or father who was taken from you on that terrible, terrible day. But no force on earth can ever take away your memories, diminish your love, or break your will to endure and carry on and go forward. Though we can never erase your pain or bring back those you lost, we can honor their sacrifice by pledging our resolve to do whatever we must to keep our people safe. On that day, not only did the world change, but we all changed. Our eyes were opened to the depths of the evil we face. But in that hour of darkness, we also came together with renewed purpose. Our differences never looked so small. Our common bonds never felt so strong. The sacrifice grounds on which we stand today are a monument to our national unity and to our strength. For more than 7 decades, the Pentagon has stood as a global symbol of American might, not only because of the great power contained within these halls, but because of the incredible character of the people who fill them. They secure our freedom, they defend our flag, and they support our courageous troops all around the world. Among the 184 brave Americans who perished on these grounds were young enlisted service members, dedicated civil servants who had worked here for decades, and veterans who served our nation in Korea, in Vietnam, and in the Middle East. All of them loved this country and pledged their very lives to protect it. That September morning, each of those brave Americans died as they had lived, as heroes, doing their duty and protecting us and our country. We mourn them, we honor them, and we pledge to never, ever forget them. We also remember and cherish the lives of the beloved Americans who boarded Flight 77 at Dulles Airport that morning. Every one of them had a family, a story, and beautiful dreams. Each of them had people they loved and who loved them back. And they all left behind a deep emptiness that their warmth and grace once filled so fully and so beautifully. The living, breathing soul of America wept with grief for every life taken on that day. We shed our tears in their memory, pledged our devotion in their honor, and turned our sorrow into an unstoppable resolve to achieve justice in their name.
U.S. President Donald Trump there speaking at the commemoration ceremony at the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial to mark the 16th anniversary of the September 11 terrorist attacks. Well, Al-Qaeda and ISIL may not agree on much, but they and their affiliates remain potent threats here in Africa, regardless of their mission. As we heard, Al-Shabaab remains the biggest threat to East Africa, and by extension, Al-Qaeda's threat is far from over in the region. Lucien?
Thank you very much. Yes, Beatrice Marshall joining us from Nairobi, Kenya, and many thanks to CNM Dar joining us from Washington, D.C. And we are wrapping up this special edition of The Point with Miliu Shin. As usual, we don't go without my last point. The U.S. government may have done a relatively good job in deterring foreign terrorists from entering its territory. The stringent security checks, for instance, as a result of the 9/11 attacks for flights bound for the U.S., have been accepted by airports and travelers around the world, and there have been no 9/11 style attacks ever since. But what happens outside its border is a different story. The U.S.'s war on terror has backfired. Just now we heard U.S. President Donald Trump talking about the Pentagon being the symbol of U.S.'s military might. I think for people outside the U.S. is also a symbol of U.S.'s military interventionism. The Islamic State was a direct result of the power vacuum and political chaos following U.S.'s invasion of Iraq in 2003 in the name of fighting terrorism and in pursuit of its own geopolitical interests. To make matters worse, the U.S. government wanted to build Western-style democracy in countries such as Iraq or Afghanistan, ignoring the local historical and cultural circumstances. Now, as these countries try to stand on their own, U.S.'s vested interests still stand in the way. Although the U.S. has claimed victory in fighting terrorism on its home soil and in some parts of the world, to win the global fight against terrorism is not just about who has bigger guns, but more importantly about who can help improve local governance and development. And that's all for this edition of The Point with Miliu Shin. As always, follow us on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.